Oh, fuck. Okay. Back in late 2020, I learned that there was a YouTube rerun for an anime called Oishinbo. Now, I had never heard of Oishinbo prior to this, but a good friend of mine informed me that this YouTube release came with English subtitles. YouTube reruns aren't uncommon. In fact, there are multiple channels airing reruns of anime right now. For example, TMS has an international YouTube channel where they're hosting anime like Space Cobra, Gusty Frog, and many more with English subtitles, as well as the Sonic X dub. Hell yeah. Even Heybot got its own YouTube rerun on the Bandai Namco Pictures channel, though unfortunately for me that didn't come with any subtitles. These YouTube reruns are often done to promote a product or gauge the popularity of a specific series. In the case of Heybot, its rerun coincided with a promotion for the DVD and Blu-ray releases, where if they received 100 pre-orders they would release the product. In the case of Oishinbo, its run was promoting the already released DVDs and Blu-rays. Though unfortunately, because these are just promotions for a product, episodes were deleted after a few weeks, meaning if you didn't watch them as they're released, you missed out. Anyways, tangent aside, what's strange about Oishinbo's YouTube release is that neither the DVD or Blu-ray release came with any English subtitles, just the YouTube release. Though I'm not complaining, I managed to jump on the Oishinbo train early and thoroughly enjoyed the almost year-long journey it took to watch. I'll say it again, I hadn't heard of Oishinbo prior to this YouTube release, which is why I was pretty bummed out to learn that it's relatively unknown in the Western community. When looking online for any English information on Oishinbo, I was met with only a handful of articles and a pretty bare-bones wiki page, which only really said that Oishinbo is one of the best-selling manga in Japan, selling a total of over 135 million copies out of 111 volumes. And alongside its 136 episode anime, it has 2 animated films, a live action film, a goddamn Famicom visual novel adaptation, and its popularity has spawned countless references in Japan's pop culture? Okay, that's a lot to take in. Let's just take a step back for a moment, because what even is Oishinbo? And why is it so popular in Japan? This is Oishinbo's first volume. Beginning serialization back in 1983, the manga has since spanned over a whopping 1,000 chapters, with 111 volumes in total, 105 of which I actually own. If the manga kept serializing, it would have been longer than the likes of One Piece and Detective Conan, but we'll get into why it didn't later on. Speaking of Detective Conan, I think that series works well as a point of comparison for the structure of Oishinbo's storytelling. In Conan, the Black Organization storyline isn't really the main focus of the series, but rather a driving force behind the episodic detective cases that take up a majority of the chapters. It's the same idea in Oishinbo. The story follows the lives of a journalist and food critic named Yamaoka Shiro and his co-worker Kurita Yuuko. They're tasked by the newspaper company to provide unique recipes for an article aptly titled The Ultimate Menu. And starting off the series, that's all there really is to it. This storyline is then used as building blocks for the episodic stories, wherein Yamaoka finds himself in various situations either learning about new cuisine or meeting new people and teaching them about cuisine. With that being said, this storyline isn't the sole driving force behind the series. You have Yamaoka himself to thank for that. From the very beginning, Yamaoka is characterized as being clumsy and lazy, illustrated by his very first appearance lazing about on a couch at work, scaring Kurita on her first day in the office. However, later on in the chapter, during a tofu tasting competition that he characteristically turns up late for, Yamaoka demonstrates his genuine skill and passion for food. This is further exemplified in the next chapter where Yamaoka skillfully fillets a massive fish out in the middle of the ocean. It's this juxtaposition of a seemingly lazy man whose personality is completely 180'd when it comes to his true passions that makes Yamaoka a genuinely captivating main character.
In the anime, Yamaoka is made even more lovable by an amazing performance by Kazuhiko Inoue, who I think captures Yamaoka's two personalities to a T.
もうこんな時間か。寝足りないな。山岡。これはどうも。やれやれ。日本の食通と奉られてる人間は滑稽だね。何?
If it wasn't clear already, Oishinbo is a series all about food. In Japan, there's actually a term for this kind of manga called Gurume, which just translates to gourmet. The most recent and, well, definitely most popular example of a Gurume manga in the West would be Shonen Jump's Food Wars. But Gurume's origins, even in Shonen Jump's history, date way back.
There are many examples of Gurume manga out there, but one of the most prominent of the bunch I'll mention is Shonen Jump's Hochonin Ajihei in 1973, a series about a boy named Ajihei who strives to become a professional chef, looking up to his father, who's an expert in traditional Japanese cuisine.
However, to his father's dismay, he takes up a job at a fast food restaurant with the ambition to become the best at making both inexpensive and tasty foods for the masses. This idea that food should be accessible and enjoyed by all is pretty common in Gurume manga, and, well, of course, especially in Oishinbo. That's what this video is about after all.
Though what's interesting about Ajihei is how the manga's author, Jiro Gyu, had experience working in a restaurant. Thus, he was able to apply his knowledge and experiences into the story. What's also interesting is how you can spot several quirks still present in Gurume manga today, like exaggerated reactions when people eat food as a way to convey how good it tastes to the reader. And, well, we all know the modern day equivalent of that. What the fuck?
In the 1980s, there was a massive boom in mainstream popularity for Gurume manga, like Cooking Papa, Aji Ichimonme, and Mr. Ajiko, all of which sort of had this educational edge to them. And of course, among them was Oishinbo, which skyrocketed in popularity upon its release in 1983, becoming the most recognizable of the bunch.
It's a taxi.
A big reason why Gurume manga had this popularity boom was not only its association with the Japanese economic bubble at the time, where an interest in fine dinings and luxury goods reached a peak, but also its ability to appeal to a variety of different readers.
Because a large majority of chapters are self-contained, the immediate appeal of Oishinbo isn't any overarching story or romance, but to learn about unique foods and cuisine. Every chapter and episode is filled to the brim with information on a particular cuisine, and certain stories even have Yamaoka traveling around Japan, exploring unique locations and describing in great detail the agriculture in different prefectures.
There's even multiple chapters that feature real-life restaurants. So many, in fact, that there's a book compiling every restaurant featured titled Oishinbo no Mise. Now, I don't actually own it, but I'll just put a PNG here. Oh shit, it's a B. What the fuck?
This educational approach means anyone from the average white-collar worker to your mom can pick up a volume of Oishinbo and enjoy what it has to offer. This is especially true in the anime, where each episode is also a self-contained story, so anyone can watch a random episode as it airs and understand what's going on.
And of course, for those who want the full Oishinbo experience, they can just pick up the manga from the beginning. I do believe this was intentional by the author, and it's part of why I think Oishinbo managed to gain such mainstream success. Though now that I think about it, I can't believe I've gone this far without mentioning the author. I should probably do that.
Oishinbo's author is Kariya Tetsu, self-proclaimed Kuishinbo, a Japanese word for someone who loves to eat, which is actually where the title Oishinbo comes from, combining the words oishi, meaning yummy, and kuishinbo together. Huh, how cool is that? Kariya Tetsu has a fascination in food and frequently travels around Japan and other countries doing his own research about the different cuisines, meaning the manga is basically a collection of his own research notes. Though, with that being said, in a 1986 interview conducted with Kariya Tetsu, he firmly denies being a food connoisseur.
Unlike the author of Ajihei, who applied his knowledge working in the industry into his manga, Kariya Tetsu studied quantum mechanics and worked at an advertising company for almost 4 years before becoming a mangaka.
It's even more puzzling when looking at his earlier works like Hitoribochi no Rin and Otokogumi, these sort of masculine, brutal, anti-authoritarian works. But this abrasive approach to manga isn't far off from Oishinbo's origins. You see, Oishinbo originally began because Kariya Tetsu simply loved food. He thought that with how much he loves eating, wouldn't it be great if it could count as research expenses? Which is the funny reason, but it's also because Oishinbo originally began as a commentary on the gourmet boom.
People say that we're in an era of overindulgence, but to me, it's more like an era of disillusionment. My current focus regarding food is about whether we can improve this situation we're in. When you pursue food authentically, various issues arise. This has led to controversies over things like soy sauce, rice, and milk. The interesting part is how these small familiar things expand into larger issues. Oishinbo is about taking the world of food seriously.
Kariya Tetsu is someone who's very vocal about his stance on current social issues.
Otokogumi was about anti-authoritarianism and used kung fu and karate, which were popular in manga at the time, as a way to represent masculinity and fighting for one's own beliefs. Much like how Oishinbo is a platform for Kariya Tetsu's cuisine research, it's also a platform for his political commentary on current social issues. This is made clear from the very first volume, with chapter 9 being a story all about the difference between free-range and caged chickens. Oftentimes, this commentary causes controversies, but Kariya Tetsu always stays true to his own beliefs and research. If you know anything about Oishinbo's legacy, you'll know what I'm talking about, but I am getting a bit ahead of myself. More on this later. So, ironically, Oishinbo began somewhat as Kariya Tetsu's critique of the gourmet boom. And I'm not talking about the food itself, but more so the social aspects of its sudden popularity. Throughout the series, there's a focus on pursuing food and its various tastes authentically, in contrast to staying uneducated or blindly following trends or ideals. But despite how this may seem, this is never framed in a pretentious way. In fact, in the series, there are many instances of characters criticizing the pretentiousness found within the gourmet scene.
If Oishinbo is so critical of its own space, then why is it so popular? Well, in that same 1986 interview, Kariya Tetsu states that Oishinbo isn't aimed at culinary specialists. And well, yeah, that's true. That's something you can see reflected in the themes and story of the series.
Oishinbo isn't really focused on a character's perseverance in the face of impossible odds, craftsmanship, and the quest for excellence as Gurume manga is described by the book Manga, The World of Japanese Comics. Yamaoka isn't on a quest to perfect his skills or technique, but rather providing others with knowledge about making delicious food using good ingredients. Oishinbo has a sense of relatability because it places emphasis on everyone learning about food and enjoying it together.
That isn't to say there aren't culinary specialists within the series, and there are chapters that focus specifically on cooking techniques, but a majority of the series places emphasis on characters ranging from professionals to ordinary everyday people, describing the deliciousness of food and how to achieve that taste authentically.
And this makes sense considering the fact that Kariya Tetsu isn't a chef or food connoisseur. Yamaoka works at a newspaper company, not some gourmet restaurant. This simple fact emphasizes the idea that anyone can be good at cooking no matter their profession. It's just a matter of educating oneself on what ingredients to use and how to cook properly. Yamaoka is emblematic of this because he goes out of his way to educate the many people he meets how to cook. And not to flaunt his skills, but rather to inspire others to do the same. I believe that this key difference in storytelling is what propelled Oishinbo into mainstream success.
But with all that being said, everything I've brought up is exactly why I think Oishinbo didn't catch on in the West.
That's because this is Oishinbo's only English release, Oishinbo A La Carte. Released in 2009, a full 26 years after Oishinbo started, this edition is a compilation of multiple chapters under a single theme. There are 7 different uniquely themed volumes. The first volume is under the broad theme of Japanese cuisine, followed by sake, ramen and gyoza, sushi and sashimi, vegetables, the joy of rice, and lastly izakaya, or as the Brits would call it, pubs. A la carte is seemingly related to a Japanese release under the same name, and this too is a compilation of uniquely themed chapters. It makes sense why Viz Media would choose to release this version of the manga, because by 2009 there were already over 100 volumes of Oishinbo. But still, with that being said, this release is a little disappointing to me. Despite describing Oishinbo as having self-contained stories that can be consumed in any order, a big enjoyment factor is being able to see these characters change and develop over time. We just don't get that option of reading the whole series from the start in English. Hell, the first volume doesn't even start with that iconic first chapter, which is such a shame.
This Viz Media release didn't seem to take off and stopped publication exactly a year later in 2010. And I think a big reason why is simply how ingrained Oishinbo is in Japanese culture. It's hard to imagine a Japanese political drama about Japanese cuisine catching on in the West. And it's a shame because the points I brought up before are exactly what I liked about watching Oishinbo.
It's the fact that I got to explore a completely new world of Asian cuisine each week that made Oishinbo so entertaining. Yamaoka traveling around Japan and describing different agricultural processes was endlessly captivating. I watched the YouTube release over the course of a year, and watching episodes as they were released weekly with my mother was such an enjoyable experience. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention it before, but I watched Oishinbo with my mom.
We are talking about Oishinbo.
Yeah.
Cool. I loved Oishinbo. It was a great show with a very funny character. He was naughty. Yamaoka, yes, Yamaoka. He knew a lot about cooking, and I think that's what I liked most about the show. All the things that I've learned about, Japanese culinary art, and also little tips. Every episode had something interesting about different dishes. Not that I'm ever getting to cook any, but really, really interesting details, I think all the characters had their place in that show, and it made the show, come out very well. Not only the culinary part. You see, I haven't visited Japan, but seeing this show just took me there.
I want to thank my mom for agreeing to let me interview her for this video. The reason why I did this is to hopefully convey what the general appeal of Oishinbo is from someone who isn't deep into research like I am. The only thing she knew before recording was that this was about Oishinbo. No script, no nothing. But with all this said and done, there is one other aspect, aside from Japanese cuisine and social aspects, that I think helps with Oishinbo's sense of relatability. And that has to do with its art.
This is something brought up by an amazing academic paper on Oishinbo written by Laurie Brow, which I highly recommend checking out, that I had never even considered before. Oishinbo is illustrated by Akira Hanazaki, who, by the way, has seemingly only worked on Oishinbo. His art style implements a stylistic technique known as masking. Masking describes when characters are illustrated in a simplistic art style, while backgrounds and other key objects are, in contrast, illustrated with great detail. Since food is the main focus of Oishinbo, they're often illustrated almost photorealistically. This creates the effect where the food is always the most prominent aspect of any given panel, placing emphasis on food as fact and story and characters as fiction. I'm personally a huge fan of Oishinbo's cartoonish art style, and not because of the masking effect, but because Yamaoka looks like a gremlin. I mean, look at him, he's just a little guy, oh my goodness.
It makes sense why Oishinbo implements these different art styles together, considering how the ultimate goal of the series is to educate the reader. If food was illustrated in a simplistic art style, it loses a lot of that believability as a real thing. Though, with that being said, something I didn't see mentioned by the academic paper written on Oishinbo is how the art style changes and evolves over time.
As the series goes on, almost every character loses that simplistic, cartoonish design they had in the beginning. Yamaoka's design especially changes quite drastically. Yamaoka's anime design is actually very similar to his later design in the manga, and it's because the anime doesn't lean nearly as much into the masking art style. You can imagine it's hard to replicate that effect when characters are lively and have their own voices. The anime can make their personalities shine through in a unique way the manga just can't capture.
That isn't to say there aren't elements of masking present in the anime. Backgrounds and food illustrations are kept detailed, and while it isn't photorealistic levels of detail, it's all the more made up for by visual consistency and sound design.
A great example of Oishinbo's sound design is in episode 2 during a tempura cooking battle. This scene depicts not only the change in colors as the shrimp are fried, but the sound they make too.
We meticulously followed the changes in color by frying tempura in the studio. For the sound design, we actually recorded the sound of the tempura frying, and used various techniques like reverb to emphasize the sound.
It's a small detail, but I think stuff like this adds a layer to Oishinbo's immersion that creates a similar effect as masking does in the manga. And this level of detail can be found in more aspects than just sound design.
Making the food look delicious in the anime is all about the characters' performances, as in the expressions characters make when eating. Take Oishinbo Bonsai for example. Oftentimes these unfamiliar dishes that appear on the show don't look particularly appetizing at first glance, but in such cases it's the expressions and reactions of people like Fumio Watanabe and Takanori Murano after taking a bite that convey the deliciousness of the food. Also, especially in Japanese cuisine, we pay special attention to the presentation of dishes, the setting of the dining area, and the props and atmosphere that highlight the food. If we don't put in that much effort, there's no point in doing an Oishinbo anime.
The anime is also very visually consistent, and this makes sense considering a majority of the series is just characters sitting around talking to each other. If shots were static and uninteresting, it would make these scenes significantly harder to sit through.
The anime avoids this problem by constantly moving the camera around, usually showing each character's reactions in any given scene. A good example of this is during a train scene in episode 29. Despite the entire scene consisting of characters just talking and goofing around, the camera jolts around multiple different shots around the train, showing what each character is doing. What's particularly impressive about this scene is that almost every shot has a uniquely drawn background. This consistent attention to detail is exactly what makes Oishinbo's anime so engaging and immersive. Not only that, and yes, there's more to this part, there is one other important aspect to the visual style of Oishinbo's anime. Osamu Dezaki's visual style is written all over Oishinbo's anime. Dutch angles, split screens, extensive use of reflective surfaces, real-life lighting often protruding from the corners of the cell, shimmering light reflecting off of water, oh, and of course, an ungodly amount of freeze frames. I mean, almost every episode ends with a postcard memory of some sort. These techniques are obviously not solely unique to Dezaki, but it isn't by any coincidence Oishinbo consistently implements all of them, considering the man at the helm is Takeuchi Yoshio. Director Takeuchi Yoshio had worked extensively alongside Osamu Dezaki, starting with Jungle Kurobe in 1973 into the 1980s with Space Cobra.
Starting in the 60s, Takeuchi made his way into the anime industry after dropping out of university when he found an advertisement for Hatena Production, a studio founded in 1964 that takes up work as a subcontractor.
Takeuchi says that,
I wasn't particularly fond of anime or manga, but I had always liked movies.
Yet he applied to the studio simply because the advertisement mentioned manga eiga, literally manga films.
However, working in production at Hatena Pro, Takeuchi quickly expressed his interest in directing and became an assistant director alongside Hiroshi Sasagawa, who you may know for his work as director for the Time Volcan series and Speed Racer.
Takeuchi's first project as an assistant director was Toei Animation's Mouretsu Atoro in 1969. However, Hatena Pro disbanded in the same year, with the company splitting into multiple different offshoots. During the studio's dissolution, Takeuchi started to distance himself from anime production.
I didn't have a strong attachment to animation, so I went back to working like I did in my days as a student, doing various part-time jobs like preparing manuscripts for publishers and cleaning films.
Around this time, a colleague of Takeuchi's from Hatena Pro, Toshitsugu Mukaitsubo, who he had a shared living space with for about 2 years, joined Tokyo Movie Shinsha as an episode director for Attack No. 1 and encouraged Takeuchi to try anime production again.
So, from 1971 onwards, Takeuchi Yoshio worked in Tokyo Movie Shinsha projects as a director and assistant director, starting with Attack No. 1 and Shin Obake no Kyutaro. It wasn't until 1937, during the production of Jungle Kurobe, where Takeuchi first worked alongside Osamu Dezaki.
I've known Takeuchi since Jungle Kurobe. He's a great assistant director, and I rely on him completely. He can also write scripts, and he's even done storyboards for Ashita no Joe and Botchan. Although he does have a delicate personality, he's very approachable, the kind of person who makes you feel comfortable and brings people together. He's particularly good at lighthearted works like Bakabon, creating soft and humorous pieces that I could never achieve. I feel like his work reflects his personality.
Takeuchi Yoshio became an employee at Madhouse, where Dezaki had been working at the time, and worked exclusively as an assistant director and scriptwriter on Aim for the Ace.
From then onwards, he essentially studied under Osamu Dezaki as an episode director and assistant director on Gamba no Boken, Ienaki Ko, Takarajima, Versailles no Bada, Ashita no Joe 2, and many more.
With all that being said, Takeuchi's connections with Tokyo Movie Shinsha stayed strong as he continued working alongside the studio up until 1986. Anyways, it wasn't until 1982 when Takeuchi Yoshio got his first gig as chief director on Space Cobra alongside Osamu Dezaki.
I feel like he's a bit lacking when it comes to action, but he's more than capable enough to handle anything. So I think I'd like him to work on the TV series Space Cobra. I believe it will expand his range even further.
And even though Osamu Dezaki's name remained in the credits when he went to go work on the Golgo 13 movie, which released in May of 1983, Takeuchi was the sole director of the series from the second season onwards.
His first work as director on a series without Osamu Dezaki at the helm was Cat's Eye in 1983, a series that, without prior knowledge, I could very easily see myself mistaking for a Dezaki-directed anime, supported by multiple shared staff from Dezaki's other works. Leading us into 1988, where he would go on to direct Oishinbo with Shin-A Animation.
Okay, so cool. He worked alongside Osamu Dezaki, and many of Dezaki's techniques, which you can find in his anime, can be found in Oishinbo. But why am I bringing this all up? Well, it comes back to the idea that Oishinbo is constantly trying to find ways to make any individual scene visually interesting.
Much like other Gurume series, Oishinbo features the occasional cooking battle. However, unlike other Gurume series like Food Wars, for example, it doesn't have the luxury of being overly exaggerated, where its entertainment is found through the absurdity and high stakes of the cooking battles, and also because the characters' clothes explode. Oishinbo is slow and methodical, so it instead builds tension during cooking battles against Yamaoka and his rival Kaibara Yuzan using visual techniques. The most obvious example of this is the extensive use of split screens. They're almost used solely in scenes with Kaibara and Yamaoka, with Kaibara often portrayed looking down at him with a frightening glare as if signifying his superiority. Lighting is also occasionally used as a means to build tension, and episode 131 is a great example of this. It begins with Yamaoka reflecting on a conversation he had earlier at the company. This scene is framed in a very dramatic way by use of its stark orange lighting and shading. Orange light is used throughout the episode to signify uncertainty, building a sense of suspense as the episode continues. I'm a huge fan of this absolutely stunning scene of Yamaoka standing out by the seaside with glistening orange light reflecting off of the water. All of this tension leads into the cooking battle at the end of the episode where Yamaoka and Kaibara face off. The use of this striking visual imagery made episode 131, to me, one of the most suspenseful in the entire anime. And mind you, it's not just cooking battles and suspense. There are many examples of visual techniques being used just to make a scene more interesting. One example that comes to mind is episode 133, and it's a good example because Takeuchi Yoshio storyboarded it himself. Halfway through the episode, Yamaoka finds himself in a bar discussing with another character. Throughout the scene, the camera is all over the show, with a gorgeous shot of the piano, in between bottles, and reflections on the countertop. They didn't need to go so hard on a scene where characters are just talking, but again, I appreciate this level of detail as a way to make these scenes more engaging.
I'd be lying if I said I'd be nearly as interested in these scenes of characters just talking without the interesting shot composition and visual techniques. Now, I don't want to paint the picture that Oishinbo is otherwise boring. Not at all. It's just that its visual language aids its storytelling capabilities. Because of course, these scenes would serve no purpose without any story or characters.
So, finally, we're at the part where I talk about the characters. As I've mentioned before, Yamaoka is always willing to support others and encourages people to become more knowledgeable about food and culinary arts. I love how food is used as a basis for getting to know different characters throughout the series. A surprising amount of episodes use food as a thematic element to tell the story. A good example of this is episode 3, Yasai no Sendo, where Yamaoka and Kurita visit the launch of a new department store. Disappointed by the state of stale vegetables sold in the food court, Yamaoka quite harshly criticizes the store owner's practices. In a fit of rage, we learn that the store owner, Itayama, grew up in poverty and therefore takes great pride in his business. Armed with this knowledge, Yamaoka takes Itayama to a local farm where fresh vegetables are grown. After trying a fresh tomato that reminds Itayama of the organic flavor from his childhood, Yamaoka goes on to explain that tomatoes sold at Itayama's stores were picked before they were fully ripened, only turning red once they reach the shelves after a long distribution process. So, despite looking ripened, their taste isn't. Itayama decides to change his distribution process, and this decision in turn helps his business thrive. From then on, Itayama shows up throughout the series as a friend of Yamaoka's. Another great example of what I'm talking about is episode 48, Haha Naru Ringo, a sentimental story about a man reconnecting with his mother through the familiar taste of apple pies. After a messy divorce between her husband and moving to the United States, her son, Aosawa, resents his mother for abandoning him at a young age. Yamaoka meets with Aosawa at his art gallery, who was with a friend of Kurita's from university named Minato. After the art gallery visit, they spend more time together at a cafe where Aosawa orders an apple pie and apple tea. However, he becomes furious upon trying the apple pie, saying that its flavor is fake.
悟さんはどこに行ってもアップルティーとアップルパイを注文するのよ。そして必ずまずいって文句を言うの。
仕方がない。本当のことなんだから。
そうそう。青沢さん、美奈子とそろそろでしょ？
As a result of his parents' divorce, he struggles to commit to relationships. During the same scene, he states that there's no point in marriage and that he doesn't have the confidence or ability to raise children. And this negatively affects his current relationship with Minato. A few weeks after this encounter, Kurita receives a call after publishing an article about Aosawa's art gallery from someone claiming to be Aosawa's mother, and Kurita agrees to meet with her alongside Yamaoka.
私は離婚した時に息子を2人とも引き取りたかったのです。でも家庭裁判所の調停で子供は両方が1人ずつ引き取ることと決められてしまいました。弟の充はその当時まだ1歳の血のみ子でしたし、私としては充の方を取るしかなかったのです。
お母さんもお辛かったんですね。
はい。一目だけでもいいから会いたいんです。会ってあの時のことが謝りたくて。
Aosawa's mother and Minato both plead to Yamaoka to help convince Aosawa to meet with his mother again. Yet it's proved to be futile as Aosawa has grown to hate his mother after years of resenting her, refusing to meet with her despite the fact she came to Japan. However, Yamaoka, as always, comes up with a plan. He invites Aosawa to a cafe where he serves them an apple pie and apple tea using real ingredients. Aosawa exclaims in excitement that this was the flavor and aroma he was looking for, and Yamaoka goes on to explain that apples, which are commonly used throughout Japan, prioritize sweet flavors first and foremost, while the apples used in this pie and tea were Jonathan apples, which have a tardier flavor. Yamaoka then reveals that this flavor that Aosawa was looking for is the flavor of his mother's cooking from all those years ago. Despite this revelation, he still refuses to meet with her, telling her to go home despite showing up at the cafe.
どうしてそこまで意地を張らなきゃいけないの？お母様はあなたを捨てたわけじゃないのよ。仕方がなかったんじゃない。
うるさい！黙っててくれ！
甘ったれないでよ。
何？
そうじゃないの。あなたは自分を甘やかして拗ねてるのよ。自分をごまかさないで素直になればいいんだわ。
なんだと？僕が自分をごまかしてるって？
そうよ。お母さんが必要ないなんて嘘よ。あなたが20年間探していたもの、求め続けていたものがそれを証明してるじゃないの。アップルティーとアップルパイよ。
It's not until Minato puts this whole ordeal into perspective that Aosawa finds the courage to come to terms with his past and forgive his mother, embracing her with a hug at the end of the episode. In many of these stories, food is used as a thematic plot device, wherein food is used to communicate feelings that words cannot. These are the stories that made me fall in love with Oishinbo in the first place, as its drama often focuses on relationships and internal conflicts between characters that are solved using food. Oishinbo's sense of community is something I love, as we not only get to know the characters, but many of them are reoccurring and have continuing plotlines. However, with this all being said, the reason why Yamaoka is so compassionate towards the people he meets isn't simply out of the good of his heart. That has to do with the main rival character of the series and also Yamaoka's father, Kaibara Yuzan. If you know anything about Oishinbo, then you know about Kaibara Yuzan. I'd honestly describe him as the face of the series, because for some reason he's an incredibly popular character in Japanese memes. I think the reason why is because of how exaggerated his elitism is portrayed in the series, to a degree that is pretty absurd. But his character is not at all intended to be funny in the series. You see, Kaibara Yuzan is a perfectionist and elitist at heart. He believes that culinary arts must always be perfect, or else it's a waste of time and effort. This is reflected in his personality and presence. He's always looming over Yamaoka in his dignified kimono and looks down upon him in almost every scene. Kaibara runs an elitist gourmet club where only the elite of the elite train their culinary skills to perfection. Later on in the series, he starts the supreme menu with a rival newspaper company to Yamaoka's, which ensues a multi-episode long battle between Yamaoka and Kaibara to find the best ingredients and recipes for their respective newspaper articles. Throughout the series, we slowly learn more about their relationship, with a significant development happening about halfway through the anime when we learn more about Yamaoka's experience with his father when he was much younger. Kaibara would physically abuse his wife. Yamaoka's mother would give her best effort to cook for her husband, but she was ultimately rejected every time. This all led to a state of exhaustion which left her bedridden, and she unfortunately passed away not soon after. Yamaoka understandably resents his father for his actions. He resents the values his father has towards cooking and takes the complete opposite approach, which explains why he's so open and all-encompassing when it comes to food. This rivalry between Yamaoka and Kaibara makes up the majority of the cooking battles throughout the series, and what I find really interesting about them is how Yamaoka isn't always the winner. While Kaibara Yuzan is portrayed as a critique of elitism and pretentiousness, with Yamaoka portrayed as morally righteous, in no way does it mean he's bad at cooking.
Oishinbo succeeded first and foremost because Kaibara Yuzan, the antagonist to Yamaoka, was portrayed as stronger than him. After all, the antagonist must be stronger than the protagonist for the story to work.
The key difference is how Yamaoka interacts with those around him. He isn't an elitist perfectionist who refuses food due to imperfections. Instead, he values providing answers and helping others with their cooking. This creates a very interesting dynamic between the two that lasts throughout the entire anime. Kurita Yuuko, on the other hand, is a significantly more relatable character than Kaibara or Yamaoka. From the very beginning and throughout the entire series, she acts as a second half to Yamaoka, a more reasonable and diligent worker who actually cares about what the ultimate menu article means to their company. There's a sort of running gag where Kurita often finds herself yelling at Yamaoka to stop being lazy at work and get going with their obligations. And it's indicative of the relationship they share with one another. However, it's important to note that this isn't the sole purpose Kurita serves in Oishinbo's story. Having a more reasonable character within scenes where Yamaoka is essentially info-dumping facts about food gives the viewers a grounded perspective through the lens of Kurita. She's often portrayed surprised or intrigued by the culinary facts, and she asks questions any reasonable person may have. This series wouldn't be the same without a character like Kurita, who reminds us that these guys are kinda crazy, and it makes sense why she's the voice of the narration in the anime.
Of course, the protagonist is Yamaoka, but he's a very unique character, a cynical and genius gourmet, so it's hard for the general audience to relate to him. That's why we decided to take the approach of having the viewers experience the story through the eyes of an ordinary girl, Kurita Yuuko.
And for those who might have put 2 and 2 together with my wording there before, Kurita becomes quite literally the second half of Yamaoka as they start dating and get married in volume 47, and by volume 100 they have 3 kids together. My goodness. There are some very interesting developments that happen later on in the manga that unfortunately weren't adapted into the anime, and because I'm not the best at reading Japanese, I haven't been able to read those chapters myself. However, the academic paper goes into great depth about a significant story beat that happens later in the manga, so I'd definitely recommend reading it if you're interested.
Those are just the main 3 characters of Oishinbo, and while there are other characters I could mention, I think I'll leave it there for those who want to experience the series themselves. And to be totally honest, this is where I'd love to end off the video. I've talked about pretty much every aspect I love about Oishinbo. Yet there is unfortunately a massive elephant in the room that cannot be ignored. And that's Oishinbo's controversies.
Great, so this is the part where I turn into a commentary channel. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Kariya Tetsu is someone who's very vocal about social issues and his stance on politics. This has led to Oishinbo having its rather large share of controversies, so many that there's a long section entirely about the controversies on Oishinbo's Japanese wiki page. For example, a chapter released in a Big Comic Spirits issue from 2000 caused controversy over misinformation. This chapter contained a depiction of and recommendation for feeding infants honey and soft-boiled eggs. That seems pretty tame, but turns out this is something you should not do, because it can lead to infant botulism due to a type of bacteria that can be found in honey. On the political side of things, the most infamous examples are episode 27 and 28 from the anime, a 2-parter all about the anti-whaling movement in Japan in the 1980s. These episodes are infuriating in many ways, even to me as someone who loves the series. I had a huge paragraph written about these episodes in my script, but considering how long this video has become, I don't want to drag it out being pedantic. Plus, if you talk to anyone who has seen the Inca Subs release of Oishinbo, you'd hear a multitude of complaints about these 2 episodes. Funnily enough, the whaling episodes weren't nearly as controversial in Japan if my sources are anything to go by. According to the Japanese wiki page, a writer who wrote about Oishinbo's controversies praised the story's framing of the anti-whaling movement as hypocritical, and according to Takeuchi in an Animage article, fans of Oishinbo were excited for the anime to adapt the whaling chapters.
Until now, we had been holding off on addressing social issues, but we received so many phone calls and postcards from viewers asking, why aren't you doing it? They're right. If we only stick to safe topics, it wouldn't truly be Oishinbo. The producer also felt the time was right and gave the go-ahead.
But anyways, I hope this all goes to show how abrasive Kariya Tetsu's writing can be. These controversial episodes are such a big deal that the YouTube rerun skipped out on 15 episodes out of 136, meaning they only ran 121. I assume this was done just to avoid any issues with poorly aged misinformation or politics. It's kind of impressive how Kariya Tetsu is able to elicit such reactions out of his audience. And this is no less evident than in Oishinbo's biggest controversy. One so big that not only did an entire prefecture write a letter in protest, but the late Shinzo Abe himself made comments regarding the controversy. This is the controversy that put Oishinbo on hiatus after over 1,000 chapters and 111 volumes. Yes, that's right, we're talking about the Fukushima disaster controversy. I'm sure we're all familiar with the 2011 Tohoku earthquake. A magnitude 9 earthquake which shook the country, causing a destructive tsunami which led to a nuclear disaster at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. In the aftermath of the disaster, Kariya Tetsu had spent, according to him, 2 years researching and interviewing residents and people helping out with the rescues and repairs about the effects of radiation on the surrounding area and specifically agriculture. That's because, as teased in the end of volume 109, released in 2012, Oishinbo would tackle the subject of Fukushima's nuclear disaster. At first, Kariya Tetsu only intended to cover his research over 12 chapters, however this was extended to 24 chapters for a total of 2 volumes. I should clarify now that the controversy regarding these chapters wasn't about the series covering the Fukushima disaster and the effects of radiation on agriculture. As far as I could tell, there wasn't too much buzz regarding the subject matter itself. It wasn't until the release of the 22nd chapter of the Fukushima storyline in late April of 2014 where issues arose. That's because in this chapter, Yamaoka receives a nosebleed after returning from his trip to Fukushima. On Twitter, one user posts a protest against the chapters, expressing that as a resident of Fukushima Prefecture, they've never experienced any nosebleeds, which got a sizable amount of engagement and replies expressing similar concern. According to Kariya Tetsu on his blog post made on the 4th of May, Chapter 22 caused a huge commotion at his editorial department, and while he expected some backlash about the nosebleeds because radiation levels was a divisive political issue in the country, he didn't expect such a stir. However, in usual Kariya Tetsu fashion, he writes in his blog,
"Should I close my eyes to the truth and write convenient lies for certain people? If I wrote Fukushima is safe, Fukushima is okay, or Fukushima's recovery is progressing well, maybe everyone would have been happy. The subtitle of this Oishinbo story is The Truth About Fukushima. I can only write the truth. Self-deception is something I despise the most. If you want to read or hear pleasant-sounding, beautiful words, you can find them in other media. Today's Japanese society is wrapped around an atmosphere of disliking inconvenient truths and seeking comfortable lies. If you don't like Oishinbo, I recommend you read such comfortable stories elsewhere."
So, Kariya Tetsu firmly stands by his own research and doesn't back down, but after this blog post was published, the situation only got bigger. Only 3 days after his blog post was published, a letter of protest to Shogakukan, Oishinbo's publisher, was published by the town of Futaba under the new mayor who was elected last year. This letter firmly denies any resident reporting unexplained symptoms such as nosebleeds to the town office. According to the letter, Futaba Town fears that the publication of Chapter 22 will lead to reputational damage to the entire Fukushima Prefecture, which is striving for recovery, and will only promote discrimination against citizens of the prefecture. On the same day, a letter of protest was published by Fukushima Prefecture itself, expressing similar concerns in more detail and also denying health issues caused by radiation from the nuclear incident. Kariya Tetsu writes in his blog expressing concern over his editorial department receiving multiple phone calls regarding the nosebleed chapter, and advises readers to contact him directly instead, but states that he will not answer to interviews until after he finishes the 24th chapter. However, on the 17th of May, Shinzo Abe himself makes a statement regarding the controversy after visiting Fukushima Medical University to be briefed about the effects of radiation, stating that there is no confirmation that someone's health has been directly affected by radioactive substances, and that there is a need for the state to make all-out efforts to deal with such baseless rumors. After the statement from the Prime Minister of Japan, as you can expect, the controversy blew up big time, with even international publications like The Guardian picking up the story. By now, the last 2 chapters have released, but the damage has already been done, and Oishinbo was put on hiatus. Kariya Tetsu writes in his blog that this hiatus was decided before the release of the Nosebleed chapters, denying any causation, but it's clear that the outrage caused by the last 3 chapters of the Fukushima story was the nail in the coffin for the series. After the release of volume 111 in December of 2014, most of what you can find regarding the situation is on Kariya Tetsu's blog. In February of 2015, he released a book as a response to the Nosebleed situation which details his side of the story. I haven't been able to read that book myself, but what I can gather from his other blog posts from 2015 onwards is that Yamaoka's experience in chapter 22 directly mirrored his own experience, with many of his research team having experienced similar symptoms and a decline in health after their trip. And unfortunately, that's where the story ends. The controversy died down with the hiatus of Oishinbo. Kariya Tetsu has kept out of the public eye aside from the occasional blog post and book release, and the series has been on hiatus for over 10 years now. The reason why I brought up this controversy isn't because I have my own 2 cents on the topic, but rather to convey 2 things. First of all, Kariya Tetsu is an incredibly abrasive writer, and I believe this is another key aspect to the appeal of the series. It's just a shame that this abrasiveness has led to controversies and pretty much the series' cancellation, although still not confirmed. But that's where my second point comes in. Oishinbo has left behind a huge legacy, 31 years of publication, over 1,000 chapters and 111 volumes in total. It's easy to point fingers at the time the series does something wrong, but I think it's valuable to also look at everything the series does right. It's a shame that the large majority of Oishinbo's biggest coverage in English is about the Fukushima nosebleed controversy. Oishinbo didn't connect to millions of readers and last 3 whole decades being controversial, and that's what I'm hoping to convey by making this video. In a blog post in 2015, Kariya Tetsu writes,
"A serialized run of 30 years is too long. I think it's about time to bring it to an end, but in what manner should it conclude? I'm considering a grand finale with all the characters appearing and having a lively and fun discussion about delicious food. Please stay tuned for the announcement from my publisher."
And although that announcement from his publisher turned out to be a second blog post apologizing for making the previous post, which made it seem like the series is going to continue immediately, it's safe to assume the series has come to an end.
Thank you so much for watching this long-winded ramble about a series that I love. I wanted to make this video to put a spotlight on the aspects that I love the most about the series, and of course also to document its legacy for the English-speaking anime community. So I hope I've encouraged you to check out the series in one way or another. Even though the biggest coverage on Oishinbo in English is the Fukushima controversy, there is an amazing academic paper that I've mentioned, of course, multiple times throughout the video that I highly encourage reading. This paper was the biggest influence on this video. Once again, if you've even made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. I'm gonna go take a shit or something, I don't know.